ELI5. Why didn't they begin with dropping the atomic bombs outside cities as a warning? Groves, and even Oppenheimer, dismissed this or any other demonstrative possibility, for several reasons. First, they believed if the Japanese were forewarned, they'd find some way to take down the plane carrying the bomb. Second, neither thought that any demonstration, impressive though it might be, would be enough to convince the hardliners in Japanese cabinet to surrender. Third, there was always a chance a demonstration bomb wouldn't detonate, not a very high chance, but there regardless, and if that had happened, it might have stiffened Japanese resolve even further. The long answer is to read John Dower's excellent book War Without Mercy. The short answer is that the war had been going on for so long and was so brutal by 1945 that it was long past the time for warning shots. Other stuff to consider. 1. The nukes were not that destructive compared to firebombing. We did more damage and killed more civilians by firebombing Tokyo than we did with the two bombs combined. 2. We only had 2, maybe 3, bombs total, and we needed to get Japan to surrender to us before the Soviets conquered all of Asia. So maximum shock was the goal. Because a massive reason behind dropping the bombs wasn't actually to get Japan to surrender. It was to impress the global stage with the power of those bombs, and the destructive power of a bomb is easier to demonstrate when it actually destroys something. So the US decided to drop a nuke on top of a preschool to show off. X-200B. Apparently Americans don't like it when you tell them that all the propaganda about how the bombs were desperately necessary and the only possible way to end the war was actually just wrong. Germany was defeated and we were quickly recognizing our global dominance. Japan was the last obstacle, and a ground invasion would have cost millions of lives on both sides. They were not going to quit, and we had only that one card left before invasion. The bombs were a message to the past and future and set the stage for US globalization. For almost 5 years we had complete global superiority, till Russia got the bomb. This superiority allowed us to define the terms of surrender and began the ideological Cold War. There's a lot to be said about the decision to bomb, why, where, and how many times. Yes, other targets were discussed, including non-cities. This answers your question directly. And here's a good answer as to why the bombings were necessary. Even though Japan was willing to surrender before them, they did. They dropped warnings multiple times in advance of the bombings. Japan didn't surrender, even after the first bombing. They discussed it, but it was ultimately disagreed upon. Even after the second bombing and the agreement to surrender, there was a military coup launched against the government in an attempt to stop the surrender. There wasn't any winning. There was just less losing. Check out the operations room on YouTube. They just put out a video on the bombings and they're well done. Everyone is trying to armchair quarterback this situation through our current peacetime lens. You can't understand the decisions these people made unless you had lived through the 4 or 5 years of wartime hell, with millions and millions dead, with genocide all over the world, where you thought your world was ending. And let's not forget that some of these decision makers had been in World War I as well. You can't put yourself in their mind because you don't have the same experience or live in the same society. At the time, the US only had enough fissile material for 2 bombs, neither of which they were completely sure would work. Their entire plan revolved around making the Japanese think that they had a huge supply of these weapons, so there was no room for benign exhibition of an atomic bomb. As the Japanese didn't even contact the US regarding surrendering during the 3 days between the bombs, it's abundantly clear that a demonstration would have succeeded in only wasting a bomb. The US didn't have dozens more in reserve, there was only one more working build available if I recall correctly. More generally, the US and Japan had been in a state of total war for nearly 4 years at that point, and many other Japanese cities had already been razed by conventional bombing runs. Tokyo was completely destroyed in March of 1945 with similar casualties. It was well past the point of warning shots. The two nations were already committed to obliterating each other. 1. These were the only 2 we had. 2. And more importantly, we wanted to kill as many people as possible. Indiscriminate brutality was the point. Welcome to the nuclear age. The US broke the seal on that. The very existence of your question demonstrates how poor of a job our education system does about teaching this history. We were not some benevolent nation with demigod powers. We aren't better than anyone in the Axis powers if we killed indiscriminately like they did. It's important to remember that the entire Manhattan Project produced a total of 3 devices. One was used for the Trinity test. That means that the entire US stockpile was 2 nuclear weapons. that did not give us a lot of options in terms of using them as a warning, particularly when it was impossible to know for certain that they would actually work. Each bomb was a different design, only one of which had been tested at Trinity. One big reason is that they wanted to study the effects on the population. Before they dropped the bombs, they dropped a bunch of sensors and equipment that could measure the effects around the cities, and almost immediately after sent in scientists under the guise of doctors to help the victims to study how the survivors later died over the next few days, weeks. Basically, it was one big science experiment with live human test subjects. There was a plan to simply demonstrate the power of the bomb to Japan without destroying anything. This was rejected, however, out of fear that the bomb might be a dud, that the Japanese might put American prisoners of war in the area, or that they might manage to shoot down the plane. The shock value of the new weapon could also be lost. It was decided to drop the bomb without warning. The US was already firebombing Tokyo, which killed more people than the atomic bombs, even if done the old-fashioned way. There was not a good reason not to drop it on an actual strike. Note that Kyoto, the ancient capital, had been initially considered as prime target for the shock value, but was removed at the insistence of the US Secretary of War. I agree with what others have said, but want to mention some other factors that may not have been said. Soviets wanted to join war against Japan so that Soviets could gain control of more Asian territory like they did in Europe months earlier. This was the biggest factor. Stop Soviet expansion because they knew Soviets would be next big enemy. It is possible that US President Harry Truman ordered the atomic bomb to be dropped on Nagasaki not only to further force Japan to surrender but also to keep the Soviets out of Japan by displaying American military power. Distrust and a sense of rivalry had been built up between the two superpowers that ultimately culminated in the Cold War. The US didn't need to drop the bomb at all. They chose to because they wanted to show the Soviets what they were capable of. Japan had no natural resources and only one trading partner. They weren't going to be able to continue much longer and already had some preliminary surrender conversations. It should be noted that the war in the Pacific was terribly bloody for Americans. World War II in general was one of the bloodiest wars in history. We were wanting to end the war as quickly as possible. Even after the second bomb had been dropped on Nagasaki, it still took Japan nearly a week to surrender. We had already firebombed like a dozen cities at that point. And even after we dropped the A-bombs, the second coming 3 days after the first, it was still 6 days after that before the Japs surrendered. These people were not the type to give up easily, they weren't going to be intimidated. In the book American Prometheus, I have not seen the movie yet. It was mentioned that Russia was only a few weeks away from joining America in the fight against Japan. As I remember, the generals wanted to show the Russians what we were capable of as well. They wanted to defeat the Japanese, even if it meant the massacre of many civilians. It would have been a lot harder to convince Japan to surrender based on charred fields. They also wanted to study the effects of the bomb on those civilians and cityscapes. Please find the atomic bombings video by Sean on YouTube. It's long but it really puts into perspective why the bombs were dropped on civilians and surfaces real historical evidence that contradicts most of what you're seeing in the replies to this post. It was considered, but as mentioned we didn't have a big stockpile of these weapons and there was a concern it wouldn't be taken as a serious threat by the Japanese people. Nothing gets someone's attention like leveling a city with a single bomb. Worth mentioning, but both Hiroshima and Nagasaki had tactical targets in their vicinity, the ports of Sasebo and Kure, from which the Imperial Japanese Navy primarily operated and deployed whatever was left of their capital ships. I'm not a historical or war expert, but I would imagine the cost and logistics of building and transporting the atomic bombs would be too high to consider using them on targets with little to no repercussions. They'd already killed thousands of Japanese civilians. Over 100,000 died in the firebombing of Tokyo. Industrial centers and the civilians in them were unofficial combatants for everyone back in the day. BC they had two. And after they used one, on a city, Japan still thought the US was bluffing and only had the one. So that's what they would have done in reaction to your idea as well. Because destroying infrastructure to slow down the Japanese economy after the war couldn't be accomplished if they didn't bomb huge metro areas and kill off a shitload of workers. They would have done that if they were fighting against white people. But because they were fighting against Japanese people, they decided to just go for it. Because the Japanese would have said nice explosion, we will just carry on flying kamikaze planes into your aircraft carriers if you don't mind. Ask historians. Obviously you may not get a ELI5 answer as only, like, accredited historians can answer, but it's a cool soap to follow. It is worth remembering that the Allies did much more damage to Japan with conventional weapons than they did with atomic bombs. It is worth remembering that the Allies did much more damage to Japan with conventional weapons than they did with atomic bombs. Not only did the US give an atomic bomb warning, they did it on their own soil, filmed it, and sent it to Japan far in advance. I mean, the alternative was bombing Japan to the ground and invading, which would have killed more civilians than the bombs. Detonating atomic bombs on enemy territory is not done as a warning. Oh, no. Way too much damage for a warning. But why? Destroying an entire city in horrific ways from the air was nothing new to any side of the war. Show forces to avoid war. They were already fighting in an official war and were trying to end it. Why would you warn your enemy of an attack? That kind of defeats the purpose.